Record. Hello, our project is genetically modifying soybeans for use in biofuel production. I'm Lucy Huang.
I'm Alexis Matram.
I'm Sarah Paquin.
I'm Caitlin Triano.
And I'm Caroline Waxmansky.
We will start with the discussion of the background of our project. Then we will move into the upstream production of the genetically modified, or GM, soybean, followed by the downstream processing and scale-up and the purification of biodiesel. Lastly, we will discuss the market for our product and the economic feasibility of it. First, we will introduce some background information about the motivations for our project and a brief overview of our process overall. Our project proposal has two main environmental motivations. The first is climate change. Currently, most of the energy used in the US is derived from fossil fuels, which release harmful greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that contribute to global warming. UN Goal 13, which is part of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is to slow climate change. To work towards this goal, the US follows the renewable fuel standards, which mandate an annual 15 billion gallon volume of renewable fuels. As of 2019, this volume includes 1.72 billion gallons of biodiesel produced in the United States annually. Though biodiesel reduces greenhouse gas emissions, the crops required for biodiesel production use a lot of water. This negatively impacts UN Goal 6, clean water and sanitation. Alarmingly, over 80% of water consumption in the US can be attributed to agriculture, which includes the crops grown for biodiesel. Currently, 70% of biodiesel produced in the US is from soybean oil. However, soybeans have such a high water consumption rate that approximately 80 gallons of water are consumed for every gallon of biodiesel produced from soybean oil. To work towards both climate change and water usage UN goals, we propose a novel GM soybean with decreased water consumption. The first step in our process is to use recombinant DNA technology to increase the expression of the photosystem II protein, PSBS, in soybeans, which will decrease the water consumption needs of the soybean plants. We will then scale up these GM soybeans to create enough seeds to outsource to farmers. We plan to outsource to approximately 20 farms where they will plant and harvest our GM soybeans. The soybean oil will then be extracted by a process of preparing and dehulling the soybeans, extracting the oil, desolventizing, and oil refining and processing. The oil is refined and processed through transesterification, where it is combined with methanol and a catalyst to form biodiesel and glycerin. The biodiesel is then purified using gravitational settling, centrifugation, liquid-liquid extraction, and distillation. The biodiesel is then sent to fuel companies where it is combined with regular diesel, typically making up around 5% of the final fuel.
Now we will discuss the upstream production of our GM soybean. Specifically, we will address modifications to the soybean genome, scale-up, and GM regulations. Our idea to decrease water consumption using a GM soybean is a novel idea that stems from studies done with tobacco plants. These studies show that modification of the gene that codes for the photosystem II protein, PSBS, can reduce water loss in plants by 25%. PSBS triggers the opening and closing of stomata, and it has been shown that plants with increased expression of PSBS display decreased stomata opening in response to light, which results in less water loss due to transpiration. Our idea is to genetically modify soybeans to increase their expression of PSBS and decrease water consumption during their growth. PSBS has a universal role in plants, so manipulating its expression in soybeans should be effective in decreasing water loss. The first step in inserting the PSBS gene into the soybean genome is to insert the PSBS gene coding sequence into cells from soybean leaf discs through agrobacterium-mediated transformation. Next, recombinant DNA technology will be used to fuse the PSBS cauliflower mosaic virus 35S promoter into the soybean genome to ensure constitutive expression of the PSBS gene. Genetic coding for antibacterial properties will also be added to the soybean genome, so successfully transformed colonies will propagate. Finally, polymerase chain reaction, PCR, will be used to determine copy number and homozygosity of the transformed cells. Our GM soybean must meet certain regulations in order to be grown. Our soybean is not intended for food products and therefore must only meet the standards of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. We will easily meet the USDA regulation that our soybean will not be harmful to other plants because our modification only affects the stomata of the soybean. We must also meet EPA regulations that address the potential ecological impact of the GM soybean, including the risk of the GM soybean spreading beyond where it is intentionally planted, the risk that genes from the GM soybean will transfer to indigenous organisms, and potential unintended effects on non-target species.
So now we will talk about our downstream approach, addressing the scale-up of the GM soybean, the conversion into biodiesel, purification, and storage and transportation. Our initial goal is to produce 50,000 gallons of biodiesel per year. To do this, we've determined that we will need to work with 20 farms with an average of 2,000 acres each. There are several farming techniques that will be key to successfully growing our GM soybean. First, we will need to add potassium and sulfur to the soil through a fertilizer. Potassium helps to regulate the opening and closing of the stomata, a process which is critical to ensuring that our genetic modification has the desired effect. Sulfur is important because a deficiency can cause reduced plant growth and delayed maturity in soybeans. We will also manage weeds with herbicide to further promote the growth of the soybeans. We will plant the soybean seeds in late April or early May at a soil temperature of 50 degrees Celsius. We will harvest the soybeans when 95% of the pods are a tan color and moisture is at 13 to 15%. This is important because if the soybeans are harvested at less than 13% moisture, the soybeans will be brittle and are more likely to shatter. So now we'll talk about what needs to happen to make our initial goal of 50,000 gallons of biodiesel per year possible. As I said on the previous slide, we plan to work with 20 farms with 2,000 acres of land each, giving us 40,000 acres. Normally, 1 acre of land can yield 50 pounds of soybeans in a year, so we can get 2 million pounds of soybeans in a year. We also know that typically 1.5 gallons of biodiesel can be obtained from a bushel of soybeans, and a bushel is about 60 pounds of soybeans. This allows us to reach our goal of 50,000 gallons of biodiesel per year if we can get the 2 million pounds of soybeans in a year. We know that for every 5 soybean seeds planted, only 4 will be viable or capable of becoming a soybean plant. 1 pound of soybeans requires 2,800 viable seeds. So to get the 2 million pounds of soybeans in a year, we will need 7 billion soybean seeds planted per year. Using the same thought process, we found that this will require an additional 700-acre farm devoted to producing soybean seeds for planting.
Once soybeans are planted and grown, soybean oil must be extracted. The first step in oil extraction is preparing and dehulling the soybeans. First, magnets are used to remove metals and impurities that interfere with dehulling, and then the hull is removed to improve the efficiency of solvent extraction. Next, mechanical rollers are used to make thin flakes and rupture cells containing the soybean oil, which is washed out from the flakes using solvents. We will use a hexane and isopropanol mixture as our solvent to maximize oil extraction rates. We will then remove the solvent from the soybean oil through a process of desolventizing that involves a solvent-resistant membrane. After desolventizing, the oil is refined and processed through transesterification. The oil is combined with methanol and sodium hydroxide to form biodiesel and glycerin.
After soybean oil and methanol react to produce biodiesel and glycerin, we will use gravitational settling and centrifugation to separate the products because they have significantly different densities. We will then use deionized water to purify the biodiesel through liquid-liquid extraction, removing remaining glycerin, sodium hydroxide catalyst, methanol, and other impurities. Lastly, we will use distillation to remove remaining water and methanol from the biodiesel because the boiling points of water and methanol are much lower than that of biodiesel. After these purification steps, the biodiesel should meet the industry standards of less than 0.24% glycerin by weight, 0.05% sediment and water by volume, and 0.2% methanol by weight. We plan to store and transport the biodiesel in tanks similar to those used for petrodiesel, which minimize exposure to heat, sunlight, and oxygen, which can cause degradation. We will ship the biodiesel via ships, trucks, or railways, where it will be combined with petrodiesel and fuel additives, and then delivered to gas stations. Now we will consider the potential environmental and health effects of our process. For the growing of our GM soybean, one issue to consider is fertilizer runoff, which occurs when the chemicals in fertilizer escape into waterways or groundwater, potentially causing algae blooms. To prevent this, we plan to use nutrient management techniques, which involve applying fertilizer in specific amounts at certain times of the year, and drainage water management with a saturated buffer, which treats groundwater by removing nitrates. Another issue to consider is the potential for cross-pollination between the GM soybean and other nearby plants, which could disrupt the local ecosystem. While the design of the GM soybean makes this less likely, as an added precaution, we plan to use an isolation distance between the soybean fields and surrounding plants. In the production of biodiesel, we will have to consider the safety and environmental impacts of methanol and glycerin. Methanol can be toxic if ingested in large quantities, and it's highly flammable, so we plan to follow the CDC's recommendations for PPE and implement recycling and filtration systems to prevent the release of methanol to the environment. Glycerin isn't a significant environmental hazard, but to avoid creating waste, we plan to sell the glycerin to manufacturing companies. Additionally, OSHA requires us to implement controls in our process to prevent chemical releases and the ignition of spills, and establish fire protection systems and emergency response procedures.
Our total addressable market is the United States biodiesel market, which is currently valued at $22 billion. Our serviceable addressable market is a portion of the US biodiesel market that uses soybean oil to produce biodiesel, which is about 70%. Our serviceable obtainable market is approximately 0.75% of the US biodiesel market that uses soybean oil to produce biodiesel. We believe that we'll be able to capture this portion of the market due to the renewable fuel standard, which mandates the production of biodiesel. We have performed an economic analysis on our startup in order to determine the economic feasibility of our company. We modeled our growth so that we could sell 0.75% of the annual US sales of biodiesel from soybean oil. We grew our sales at the same rate of growth of the global biodiesel market, which is 4.7% compounded annually. We assumed a B100 biodiesel retail price of $3.15, which is the current US average price of B100 biodiesel. We factored several values into our economic analysis, such as labor, raw material, utility, research and development, transportation, capital expenses, maintenance, depreciation, and tax credits. Currently, the US government issues a tax refund of $1 per gallon of biodiesel produced. In order to make our economic estimates, we researched average costs that biodiesel plants typically incur. Based on all of our assumptions, we found that we would reach the end of our payback period around 6 years after launch. We also determined that our 10-year NPV would be $5.2 million and our 10-year DCF ROR would be 40%. As previously mentioned, we had originally intended to develop our startup to produce 50,000 gallons of biodiesel annually. However, after performing an economic analysis on our original plan, we found that it would take our company over 200 years to break even. Because we would only need to produce less than 1/1000th of the annual diesel market in the United States to break even, the production of biodiesel from GM soybeans would be feasible if the production were increased, which could occur under a more established biodiesel company or with heavier government funding. The positive environmental impact of our GM soybeans further justifies our biodiesel manufacturing scheme because it will provide significant benefits to society as a whole.
Overall, this project will take about 24 years to come to fruition. This long timeline takes into consideration the amount of time required to create new genetically modified organisms, approximately 13 years. We plan to pursue federal approval whilst creating the genetically modified soybean. Some steps in this process include approval of the project, scientific assessment, and right to grow. Another step that adds into this process is the construction of a manufacturing plant, assuming we do not outsource. We predict this to take an additional 10 years in order to go through FEL, front-end loading steps, as well as accounting for construction and startup times. The last part of our schedule is the official upscaling of our product from harvest to customer. Here is a Gantt chart of some of the major action items necessary to bring our product to market. It is important to note that this schedule can be significantly reduced if we choose to outsource some, if not all, of the manufacturing steps, thereby eliminating the need to build our own manufacturing plant. In conclusion, we have determined that our novel idea to develop a genetically modified soybean with an increased water efficiency to produce biodiesel is scientifically and economically feasible and environmentally beneficial. Thank you for your time. Here's a list of our resources.